So Charlie will give you a brief rundown of the history of anti-work theory.
So in most modern ideologies, work is a sort of accepted hegemonic idea. Hard work is seen as a good thing. And this is on the right, this is on the left. Capitalism, Marxist. Lenin, in State and Revolution in 1917, wrote, kind of paraphrasing the Bible, that he who does not work shall not eat. And this has kind of been an accepted view of the way things should work, that people should labor, that people should kind of input themselves in this way into the world. But not everyone sort of accepts this idea of work and doesn't accept that hard work is good or that work should even occur necessarily at all. And for instance, Crisis Group once wrote that there was no such thing as a class war, but a Marxist organization said there was no such thing as a class war, but just one labor camp, and that the goal should be liberation from, not of, labor. And so, to kind of discuss these anti-work ideas, I'm going to look quickly at three different kind of trains of thought, one based around Paul Lafarge, who I may be saying the name wrong of, one around the situationists and the autonomists. So Paul Lafarge was writing in the late 19th century, in 1883. He was a very heterodox Marxist, came from France, traveled over to Cuba as an exile where he was writing. And he wrote a very famous essay called The Right to be Lazy. And basically, his argument was broken into two parts. The first was sort of a counter-argument to this idea that work was necessary, or that work was good, that work was basically a thing that should happen. And his argument was that rather than that the bourgeoisie, traditionally in Marxist kind of polemics, had been addressed as a group that doesn't work enough, they should be forced to work. They say, the bourgeoisie sits around, they don't do anything, they just kind of leech off others. And the traditional argument was therefore that post-revolution we're going to take them and make them labor as well. There was a lot of propaganda around this idea, and he said that it should be flipped around, and rather than saying we should force the bourgeoisie to work, we should rather free the proletariat from it and allow them to adopt these lives that are more based around kind of thought and creation and fun, essentially. And he said that work was a strange delusion and that it lay at the heart of all intellectual degeneracy and all organic deformity, and rather that the impulses of man should be given a free rein because all of these impulses are by nature good. And basically his kind of, the moral half of his argument was this very romantic idea. It was this very he talks about the noble savage and this idea of a pre-capitalist man who spent his time kind of wandering around and embracing his passions and living a more free life, a less structured life. And this was something that he thought that not necessarily we should return to, but that we should capture the spirit of when we're transforming society in a socialist manner. And the second half of his argument was more kind of economic, more Marxist in a sense. He argued that low wages suppress technological innovation, and that wage labor suppresses technological innovation because we don't need these machines necessarily that could replace labor because we have cheap hands that are already there, that are easy to make do it. And he also talked about overproduction and overconsumption as being central to capitalism. And we see this train kind of throughout anti-work theory, the idea that we're producing too much and consuming too much, and the economy is essentially operating at a scale that's not necessary and that's detrimental to kind of human needs. And he said that once capitalism was over, what we nowadays call the service sector essentially wouldn't have to exist anymore. That there wouldn't be, while we'd still need to produce the basic stuff we needed to live, all the people who serve each other. At the time he was talking more about maids and domestic servants, but I think it could be extrapolated to include a lot of the things we talk about in the service sector today, would not be necessary. And so as a result we'd have a lot more people and a lot less jobs. And he said we would have to work at first, but he envisioned something like 3 hours of work a day for maybe 4 days a week for the average person. So a little bit of input, but something that could be fun and something kind of qualitatively different than labor as we see it today. The second group, almost 100 years later, was the situationists, and they were kind of a French, very heterodox revolutionary organization. Some call them Marxists, some call them anarchists, but they were certainly anti-capitalist. And they kind of took a similar starting premise that natural alienation or the struggle over life and death, the struggle to survive, had essentially been solved but what remained was social alienation, things like inequality, and the way that we're treated as kind of passive objects rather than active subjects in our own lives. Where they differed from Marxism, though, was that they didn't see the locus of this alienation in production, but in consumption, and that it was in consumption that we lost control of ourselves, and that we became alienated from the world around us. And so, under capitalism, being had been translated into having, and been replaced by having, and under late capitalism, which they called the society of the spectacle, that having had been replaced merely by appearing and merely by appearance, and so life had been organized around appearance and driven by pseudo needs, and therefore the kind of revolution must reflect this. It must be organized around consumption as well as production and around reducing consumption, and moreover that this can take place within everyday life, not in this kind of one vast sweeping away of everything as it is now that kind of traditional revolutionary theory would lean towards. And kind of one quote that sort of is emblematic of them was from Raoul Vanagan, maybe pronouncing that wrong, but he said, who wants a world in which the guarantee that we shall not die from starvation entails the risk that we will die of boredom? And that as sure as work kills pleasure, this is the second quote, pleasure kills work. And so his idea is that we have to end that division between pleasure and labor, and that we'd be able to kind of sustain ourselves through kind of almost a playful existence where we're doing things because we enjoy doing them. And an example of that might be the way that people nowadays will go out and garden and grow things in their back garden, even though they don't have to, even though they could go to the shop. They enjoy doing it, and that people could find these things they enjoy and survive that way rather than through selling their labor. And finally, the autonomists, who came slightly after in the 70s and 80s, who were an Italian movement, mainly Italian movement, very influenced by the Situationists. And Biffo, or Franco Bardi, wrote that revolution was born of the daily action of withdrawal from exploitation, of the rejection of the obligation to produce surplus value. Basically, that revolution is not about overthrowing capitalism, it's not about seizing the means of production, it's about stopping working, it's about changing the entire logic of how we exist as human beings, of redefining what a society means and what an economy means and what it means to kind of exist as human beings. And he said that the refusal of work means I don't want to get out of bed because I want to sleep and I don't want to go to work. That's essentially what he said. But that he said that this was the source of almost all innovation and progress in human history, and that people have constantly been innovating. And when we invent a labor-saving machine, we don't invent it because we say, I want to be able to work doing a different job that I also hate. We do it to reduce the need to work, and that by overthrowing capitalism, we could then kind of realize that and work less and still exist. And the final thing on them was that they took a kind of practical view of how this would live out in everyday life that's kind of epitomized in the quote that precariousness is good. And basically the idea was that you work for a few months and then you go travel, you live off that money for as long as you can, and then maybe you go work for a few months, then you quit again, and you live your life that way rather than steadily kind of advancing through a career path. And they said that this allows work to serve the interest of people rather than the interest of capitalists, because it becomes about sustaining yourself rather than about creating surplus value, about doing things like this. And kind of an addendum to that was that he opposed the idea of worker self-management, because he said it tends to equate the capitalist with capitalism, and that kind of occupied factories and occupied workplaces tended to replicate a lot of the same patterns that we see within traditional capitalism, just with the workers as the official owners rather than the capitalists. And so breaking the logic of work would therefore be the necessity of truly creating a different world, not changing who owns where we're working.
Okay, so if I talk too quietly, by the way, just shout at me and tell me to speak up, because I mumble a lot. I'm going to talk more about the state of work now, and kind of draw out some specific kind of themes that are going on at the moment, mainly based on the work of David Graeber, Mark Fisher and Bob Black. So David Graeber, anarchist anthropologist at LSE, Mark Fisher is a cultural theorist, and Bob Black was kind of an anti-work anarchist in the 1980s. And the 4/5 themes I'm going to touch on is the bureaucratization of work, the uselessness of much of the work we do, the way in which work is rewarded, the precariousness of work, or the bad side of precariousness of work anyway, and the specialization of work as well. So with the bureaucratization of work, the kind of received wisdom is that Stalinism, socialism, and social democracy is bureaucratic. We have these kind of like big state apparatus where everything is centralized and all these pencil pushers kind of wasting everybody's time and money. But Mark Fisher argues that although that was true to a large extent, neoliberalism has kind of created its own, what he calls decentralized, self-produced bureaucracy. And for him, this is the way in which we are all, often, especially public sector workers, but also private sector workers, we're all being constantly assessed. Constantly assessed because we're always being constantly surveilled, be it what we're doing on the computers or because of the CCTV in our offices or whatever, but also because we're having these constant performance assessments, these logbooks that we have to fill in, whatever. And he sees this as kind of bureaucracy changing from an individual bureaucrat doing the bureaucracy of an organization to it becoming what he calls immanent to the fabric of work itself. So almost bureaucracy becomes part of work for everybody every day. And he obviously sees this as a negative thing. He sees it as a mode of control and a mode of discipline. He thinks that if we're made to kind of jump through these kind of neoliberal bureaucratic hoops, and a kind of a common parlance term for it would be the kind of target culture of New Labour, say, would fit into this. He sees that if we have to do this, then we essentially become more business orientated and more neoliberal ourselves. But he also sees it in a kind of different way as well, in that there's often a lot of talk of bringing competition to the public sector. The public sector needs to be competitive and etc., etc. But he argues that this talk is often naturalized, as if you cut all of the red tape, then competition will naturally arise. But he argues no. He says that to create competition in these organizations, you need to, what he says, produce all kind of spurious quantificatory data. And by that he means that you need ways to compare people or organizations or bodies if they're going to compete with each other. And because of that, everyone has to be assessed, and each organization has to be assessed in multiple different ways all of the time, so they can be measured against each other, essentially. And he sees this as an inherently negative thing. The second kind of theme I want to touch on is the uselessness of a lot of work we do. So this is heavily drawing from the kind of bullshit jobs David Graeber thesis, and he essentially argues that many of the what he terms useful jobs across the world, so he lists industry, farming sector, people working in domestic services, have largely collapsed. Even with the move of manufacturing from the west to the east, like obviously these kind of jobs have collapsed locally, but he argues globally too, largely because of mechanization. And he doesn't argue that this is a bad thing, but what he argues is a bad thing is the fact that concurrent to this, we don't suddenly all have more free time, but that people are working what he calls these bullshit jobs, such as financial services, telemarketing, corporate law, public relations, and advertising. And these are jobs which he argues either produce no social value or they produce negative social value. And he kind of offers a thought experiment. It's like, if these jobs disappeared tomorrow, would society collapse, or would society even sustain any negative consequences, or would it get better? Like, and I don't know, from my personal point of view, if there was no PR, advertising, or financial services tomorrow, I feel like the world would be a happier place. And this links into the way we reward work as well, because there's been this ballooning of jobs which David Graeber calls bullshit. Other people would call them jobs that support or further the interests of capital, say. But the way we reward work too is kind of linked to this. So we see hedge fund managers, financiers, arms dealers, CEOs, corrupt CEOs of pharmaceutical companies get paid incredible amounts of money to seemingly wreck our society. And then on the other hand, we see teachers, bin men, nurses, etc. get paid very little to do the essential jobs that absolutely need to be done. Now, a capitalist or a neoliberal economist would say, well, this is simply supply and demand. You have to be very skilled to sell arms to the Saudis, or dump pharmaceutical waste in Africa or whatever. Whereas anybody can be a binman or a nurse or a teacher. But there's kind of another way to conceptualize this, which I kind of touched on before, and it's that it's not that jobs get paid or not get paid depending on how many people can do them. It's jobs get paid well if they further the interests of capital, and jobs get paid badly if they don't, or they have a negative effect on capital's interests. And we can see this, like hedge fund managers are incredibly well paid. What do? They manage capital and help it reproduce. You can also bring in another theory. Sam Bowles, an American academic, wrote a book called Guard Labor, and he argued that a third of all labor in America now essentially guards property or manages property or capital. So we have a third of our workforce essentially guarding capital in one form or another. I see that as a bad thing. I assume most people agree.
A third of the workforce of what, like, in general?
In the US, he argued.
What, of everything?
Yeah, he argued a third of the workforce in the US were involved in either the administration of, the managing of, or the guarding of capital or property in some way. But this was quite like, he included the judiciary and lawyers and things in this. So it's quite a broad categorization, but still quite interesting. And we can kind of see this in the arts as well. So like the arts, so broadly saying, I don't know, acting, singing, dancing, writing, painting, essentially they are bourgeois leisure pursuits now. Like none of them are viable professions, as maybe some people in here could attest to. Like you can't get paid a wage to do these things. Why is this? Well, in a sense, it's because the abolition of copyright, like with the internet, essentially any digital product you create, it will be shared and there's very little you can do about it. But it's also because these professions don't really contribute to the capitalist bottom line. And the key thing is here, when they do, they get paid quite well. So like journalists make their money by writing advertorials, like musicians make their money by writing music for adverts, actors and actresses make their money by doing commercials. Like this is how it is at the moment, where your work, if it is kind of prostituted to capital, then you'll get paid for it. If it's not, you don't. My third theme was the precariousness of work. So we've all heard of 0 hours contracts. Like this is that essentially. The idea that work has moved from being, I don't know, a thing where people have a stable job and they work 40 hours a week and they can expect to be in that job in 5 or 10 years' time, to one where people don't have set hours. They might get a text in the morning telling them that they're not going to be working today because they're not needed. Or they might be a freelancer who is essentially piecing their income together bit by bit via the internet. And this is a development in the workforce largely down to technology. Like the kind of our interconnectedness means that this is possible. If we weren't able to receive that text at 5 a.m. in the morning from our employer, then we couldn't work on such a basis. It's the same with many freelancers, like freelance web developers, copy editors, writers again. Like these used to be professions where, say, a newspaper would employ a writer. Now most of the work is freelance, and it means that as well as working, you are constantly searching for work all of the time as well. And this, well, I don't know, many neoliberals would put into this as kind of like very freeing, as if, okay, you don't have to work all the time, but you have the opportunity to do this and that. I think a lot of freelancers would point to it being anxiety inducing and worrying. And then I suppose my final point is the specialization of work. So under capitalism, we've always had kind of like an increased division of labor. You divide labor down into more specialized categories or more specialized roles, and it supposedly increases efficiency and increases profits. This happened in the Fordist factory. So people working on a production line, say they were making chairs. It wasn't one individual who crafted a chair anymore. One person would make the leg, one person would make the base, so on and so on. But it's still happening. One example would be the software developer. Like even now, a software developer is an antiquated term. when people develop software, there will be different specialists who design the software, code the software, and then test the software. So even now, we have jobs which we see as kind of like quite current and modern, actually becoming non-jobs because they're becoming ever more specialized. I suppose one quote to really reveal why this is a problem goes, the man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations and has no occasion to exert his understanding generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human being to become. And does anyone know who that quote is from? Because it's actually Adam Smith, which tells you something, because obviously Adam Smith is meant to be the the founding father of free marketism and modern capitalism, and even he realised that the division of labour is shit for human beings, which should tell us something. Bob Black, the 1980s anarchist that I like, agrees in his abolition of work. He argued that essentially this phenomena, I don't know, I think he said something like empties the human soul of all vigour, or something pretentious along those lines. But yeah, like, it's really quite terrible. And I think I'll stop there. Yeah, I will. Okay, so we usually write the questions beforehand, but well, we got two. I think one question.
I think the way we should word it is like, can we organize society without work in the way it is now? Can we have, I mean, we talked a little bit about like play and being able to exist without this sort of regulated, bureaucratized, hardcore labor, and can we do that?